All right, that's the session being recorded. So very good morning once again to everyone joining us today. So today we are going to be covering strategic management module number 3. We looked, if you recall, last time at Horizon Planning 2. So we looked at the medium-term future and we started analysing some of the frameworks that can be useful to use when trying to dissect strategic decision-making in the medium run. So again, remember medium run being perhaps 3 to 5 year window. So it's not immediate, it's more middle or medium term. So we're looking here at something that you can work your organization towards. And typically what you tend to find is the same CEO will at least be in place for the medium run. With the long run, there's no guarantee. CEOs can be changed, performance can go up or down, they can be under pressure. So long-term strategies, Horizon 3, perhaps may not be seen out by the same CEO, but certainly medium-term is usually one of the big flagship initiatives delivered by the, apologies, there's a lot of background noise here, just cancel that out. So we tend to find these medium run strategies, these are the ones that become flagship strategies for a CEO at any corporate organization. So what I want to do today is pick up where we left off. So we looked at competitive profile matrix, we looked at Ansoff matrix, we looked at Porter's competitive strategies, and then we looked at Pareto analysis. So these are all some of the frameworks that were useful, but we didn't quite get into the details of scenario planning. So I'm going to talk about scenario planning today. So if you bear with me, I'm just going to share my screen and we can pick up the scenario planning section that we left off at. I might need to stop this actually because it's a different window. 2 seconds, let me load the video and then I'll reshare my screen. I think it's quite a useful video for you all to watch. So this website's taking a long time to load. I don't know if just my internet is very slow or right, here we go, it's working now. Zoom, share screen. Okay, this is working for me. Apologies, the video seems to be lagging. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post the link in the chat. So please do feel free to watch it in your own time. And I do suggest that you do, simply because it gives you a concise breakdown of how scenario planning is used. And the example that I've used here is from a company, Shell, Royal Dutch Shell. I'm sure you heard of them. They are, I believe, third biggest oil producer in the world today, after some of the big American companies. So Royal Dutch Shell are one of the largest, and they use scenario planning as an exercise that allows them to predict the demand for their products, that allows them to try and understand how the future is going to be different and what they as an organization need to do to try and prepare themselves for that different future. Okay. So the link is there. I'm going to just try it one more time to see if it works, because I think it is quite useful to share it with you on the video. But as I said, my internet seems to be lagging, so it's not quite letting me load the video and then share it with you over Zoom. Yeah, it's not working. I do apologize. If you want to take a minute or two now to try and look through the video, I suggest you do that. So Anas, if you want to click on the link, spend a couple of minutes watching the video, and then we will get underway again. Okay, so I'm just going to pause the recording here. If you could just watch the video and then come back, let me know when you've seen the video. Thank you.
Sure, Dr. Stein.
Thank you.
Can you, James?
Absolutely, that's a very excellent point, and you're right. It's a combination of short-term thinking combined with long-term aspirations, and that develops the framework. So let me just share my screen again, and we'll go back to the PowerPoint slides. I'm now going to talk through the different stages of a scenario planning process. which we just observed shall go through in the video.
Yeah, sure.
Share screen. Right. Hopefully you can see the PowerPoint again, yeah? So yes, if you've all had a chance to watch the video, I'm now going to talk through the process of scenario planning. So scenario planning, first off, you start by identifying what's called your critical uncertainties that are facing your business. Now, realistically, you should only ever have 2 or 3 of these. You shouldn't really be in a position where you've got multiple critical uncertainties. These are the big things that are the threats that or potential weaknesses that your business is facing. Okay, so what have you identified when you're looking out of your business in your short-term analysis? Remember, in Horizon 1, we looked at SWOT, we looked at PESTLE, we looked at POTUS 5 forces. What were the threats? What was the things that kept your organization awake at nights? What were the things that were really impacting the potential of your business to succeed? So you should have 2 or 3 key, highly critical uncertainties. Once you've identified them, you then want to identify discrete possible outcomes for each. So that means, what is the uncertainty around, for example, the political election? You might consider 2 potential outcomes. So party A wins or party B wins. So for example, if we are in the United Kingdom, the 2 dominant parties are the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. So if you were an organisation in the UK and it's approaching general election in the next year or 2, and perhaps you're an organisation that needs to harness the support of the government to do what you do, then for you, one of the potential uncertainties is, well, who's going to win the general election? What happens if the Tories win again, so the Conservative Party come back into power? What does that mean for my business and my relationship with the government? However, what if the Labour Party win the election? What does that mean for my company, and how will I have to form relationships in the Labour Party in order for my business to succeed? So again, these are just an example, okay, for what an uncertainty might be. Now, obviously, your business might not be impacted at all by the government. So, for example, likes of Apple or Samsung or Google, they're not really going to be impacted by a change in the government in the UK. They might be impacted in the USA because the USA has a big say over their market, but certainly in the UK, they're not really going to be impacted by any changes to the UK parliamentary election. But again, so the example I've given you depends on the context of your company. As to whether or not there's a high impact or a low impact on what your business can and cannot do. So for example, in China, the Communist Party have been clamping down on businesses. So businesses like Alibaba, Tencent, JD, these companies will be looking at the next election and thinking, well, obviously if the Communist Party remain in power, which is highly likely to happen, given they've been in power for many years, what does that mean for our business? What do we need to do differently to be able to continue operating under the Communist Party rule? Or if the Communist Party were to be defeated, what does that mean for our business opportunities? What will the new government allow us to do or give us the opportunity to do? Okay, so these are just some things that you might want to consider as part of your scenario planning process. Again, it doesn't always have to be politics, it can be anything at all. So for example, as the UK or as the world emerges from the coronavirus pandemic, what will your market shape? What will market forces look like? Will there be a demand for your product? So the airline industry, for example, a lot of the bosses in the airline industry are expecting strong rebounds of demand next year as the world emerges in general from the pandemic. They're expecting that by this time next year, almost 70% of the world's population should be vaccinated. Therefore, travel should be a lot more open and a lot more accessible to everyone without the restrictions that are currently in place. So again, the idea that travel will change. So for travel bosses, they'll be looking at that and thinking, well, what happens if 70% of the world are vaccinated? What does that mean for our business? What if they're not vaccinated? What is issues? So again, these are highly uncertain situations that you might want to build into scenario planning, because you want to think about, okay, here's what the world looks like today. What does that mean for the future? Again, what you want to do here is you want to look at a small number of realistic possibilities. Now, obviously, 101 things can happen. Some things you just can't predict. So, for example, the coronavirus pandemic, if you were a strategist strategizing in 2019, there's probably realistically no way that you could have guessed a global pandemic would happen in 2020 that would bring the whole world pretty much to a stop. That's a very very difficult. It's a very extreme situation. Firstly, it's not something that happens very often, and secondly, it's not really something you would be able to guess. Okay, so there's always going to be things that get missed out. This is about making an informed and reasonably informed guess. We don't want to come up with extreme situations, because yes, you could say there might be a pandemic, but there's no way for you to work out when that pandemic is going to be, how it's going to impact people, how it's going to impact the world. So some things are just not possible to work out or figure out. So it's just about focusing on what we call a realistic possibility. So based on what is happening, what do we realistically, or what can we reasonably say might be a future outcome? And again, there's no need to include every possible outcome. So one of the possible outcomes in the election is we have what's called a hung parliament, i.e. no party wins enough votes to get outright power. So again, that's a potential scenario. But then you get into the politics of, well, who's going to form a partnership? Who's going to form a coalition? That's not what we're here for. Okay, we're not here to focus on that part. We're just here to say, in a political example, what happens when this party wins? What happens when that party wins? We don't need to worry ourselves with the detail. Okay. Once you've done that, we then have to map and vividly describe the permutations of those outcomes. So what do I mean by that? Well, we have to then think about, if that outcome happens, how does that affect our business? How does that impact our business? How will that perhaps shape the industry? How will that change the market force? Okay, so it's about considering the permutations, so the outcomes. The other thing I need to be aware of is it happens together. Things tend not to happen in isolation. So, for example, if there's a general election next year and the government changes, well, that's going to affect other things in the economy as well. So that might affect the economic policy. That might affect people's decision to spend more or less money. That might affect people's confidence in the UK, and therefore how much investors are willing to invest in the UK as a country. So again, things don't happen in isolation. They tend to happen together. So again, it's about considering the combination of those things together and how that might shape the industry, how that might shape your market, how that might shape the outcomes for your business. Okay. Now, each permutation can be taken as one scenario. So that means your critical uncertainties include the outcomes of a political election. They can also include perhaps introduction of a regulatory change. So again, for example, in the UK, there's a general election next year. This is just an example. There isn't actually a general election. Say there's a general election in the UK next year. As a result, the Labour Party win. They have a particular set of manifesto promises and policies, and these will change the regulatory terms under this area. So again, that's a big impact for you. So you would say, considering that the uncertain outcome of the election may impact the likelihood of regulatory change. And if that regulatory change, so for example, say the Labour Party have a very specific outlook on energy policy and you're working in the energy sector, then any chance of them winning might bring changes in regulation in the energy sector, and that might impact your business. So again, these are things that you'd have to consider, okay? These are things you'd have to bring together as part of your analysis and scenario planning and say, okay, it's not just the fact that a Labour Party winning will make an impact, it's a Labour Party winning and then making regulatory changes to the energy sector or to the finance sector, whatever sector you might be in, and how that could affect your business. It's about putting things together. It's not about looking at things in isolation. Once you've done that, you then have to look at how well you think your business would perform under each scenario. So again, what impact would each of these combinations have on your business? So again, you've looked at these different combinations of problems that could happen. Then consider the impact of them if they were to happen on your business. What would it mean in terms of demand from customers? How would that change or that expected change impact the demand from your customer? How would it impact your suppliers? How would it impact the employees and other stakeholders? So I'll give you a good example. Brexit had a big impact, particularly on suppliers. A lot of companies in the UK can no longer source products from certain European suppliers because they're saying it's not worth their time to supply products to the UK because it's too expensive, there's too much regulatory compliance. So again, the impact of Brexit wasn't just the fact that selling to the EU now involves additional steps. It also means getting supply of particular components for their production has also been impacted. So there's lots of other permutations of Brexit that perhaps would, if you were doing a scenario planning exercise in 2016 or 2015, before Brexit actually happened, then you would have to consider, okay, if Brexit does happen, what would the impact be on my trade with my supply network in the EU, or what would be the impact on demand from EU customers, etc., etc. Okay. And finally, employees and other stakeholders. Again, how will your employees be affected? What do your employees need from you in order to survive, or in order for them to continue to do what they do for you? Step 5 is then to identify the key variables to watch. So again, once you've considered the impact on your business, some things might not impact your business a lot. So for example, say you work in the technology sector, and you know that the Labour Party's policies are very similar to the Conservative Party when it comes to technology. They don't want to make any changes. Then the Labour Party coming to power makes no difference to you. It's not going to impact your industry. It's not going to change what you do. You're still going to do what you do, and you're still going to be able to do it without really any impact to your business. So that would be seen as a positive outcome, or an outcome with negligible effect on your business. So you don't really worry about that. That's not really a key variable. Okay. We only want to worry about what we call the key variables. Key variables are areas that will impact our business the most, either positively or negatively. So these are early warning signs that can help you understand how the critical uncertainties could impact your business. You need to have a system in place in order to monitor these early warning signs and to ensure there is understanding of any changes that emerge. Again, because it's just a guess, it's an informed guess, there's no guarantee that that's exactly how it will play out. Even if the Labour Party do come to power, there's no guarantee that they will make the regulatory change straight away. Even if Brexit was to happen, there's no guarantee that the impact will be straight away. So for example, the UK negotiated an 18-month window where they were able to get away without making any changes to the policy until 2019. So again, even though Brexit was agreed in 2016, it wasn't until 2019 that the UK actually broke away from the EU. So again, these are all examples of situations that, you know, just because something's happened, it doesn't always mean that the effect is immediate. So for example, if you're an organization, strategic planning in 2015, you might be thinking, okay, there's going to be a referendum on Brexit next year. That could mean we leave the EU. How does that affect our business in 2017? Well, at the time, you might be making scenarios, maybe making situations, but then by the time it actually got to 2017, well, nothing had really changed. Yes, the UK had voted to leave, but they hadn't actually left. They'd agreed a 2-3 year window where they were able to negotiate, they were able to try and come up with a deal. So again, the whole idea being, even though Brexit was going to happen, the impact of the regulatory changes wasn't felt until 3 years later. So again, that moves the goalposts, it moves the time frame. These are all things you can't predict. Nobody would have known in 2015 that will take 3 years for Brexit to happen. Yes, they might have said it'll take a year or it'll take 6 months, but nobody would have predicted that it'll take 3 years for the UK to actually leave the EU. So again, these are just things for us to be aware of. Yes, we've identified them, but we need to monitor them. We need to have systems in place that can pick up, you know, when things are changing, when perhaps the situation isn't as clearly defined as we thought it was. We then move on to step 6, which is all about identifying the ways that we can influence the outcome. Now, again, you can't always influence everything by yourself, okay? So it's not about saying what can we do by ourselves. Sometimes it's about saying what can we do collectively. So for example, let's go back to the energy sector example. So say the Labour Party want to make, you know, green energy the big thing. They don't like fossil fuel energy consumption. They want to make the UK net carbon zero by 2030 rather than 2050 as the current Conservative government have said. So they might bring in regulatory changes or try to bring in regulatory changes that will restrict what traditional fossil fuel companies can do. So in that situation, the fossil fuel companies might come together and put pressure on the government. One company doing it probably won't be impactful, but every single fossil fuel company in the UK coming together to say, no, this isn't fair, we don't have enough time to prepare, so on and so forth, putting pressure on the Labour government could impact. So they could actually influence what the Labour Party do and do not do, okay? So companies can have a way to influence what's going on. So usually it's by combining. If you're the only firm trying to impact things, then you're probably not going to get very far. But as I said, if every single company in the traditional energy sector, so fossil fuels, coal and gas, came together and pressured the government, for example, then there would be a big impact on the way in which they can influence the outcome of that particular scenario happening. So again, once you figured out how you're going to influence the outcome, it's then about evaluating all of your strategic choices against your scenarios. So what do I mean by that? It's basically about saying, okay, so what are the options available to us based on the situation, based on how we expect things to happen, based on how likely we think certain things are to happen, how could these things potentially impact on our business, and what can we do? What's our strategic options available to us? So usually your strategic choices should be quite robust so that when you view them against the scenarios, the ones that you come up with are the most valuable, okay? So what do I mean by that? They should be quite open to accepting different types. It should be robust. The strategic options shouldn't be rigid. It shouldn't be, if this happens, we're going to do this, full stop, because that's quite specific. And the problem with that is, as we said already, the outcome might not be clear cut. The outcome is a guess. It can go any way. It's just you trying to map out how it might look, not how it's definitely going to look, okay? So it's quite useful for you to come up with quite robust strategies that will allow you to identify and pick up any strategic decision or strategic choice, depending on the outcome of the election, depending on the outcome of a particular change, depending on the outcome of, you know, how the world emerges from COVID, depending on, you know, the introduction of new technologies. So again, if you work in, for example, the customer services sector, so one of the big things that are coming in now is what we call artificial intelligence or augmented reality. So the idea that, you know, potentially in the future, when we go into shops, it won't be people that we speak to, it'll be robots, it'll be people, it'll be, you know, artificially intelligent machines that will be able to help us, that'll be able to give us the exact information, that'll be able to, you know, replace human beings. So again, that might not happen straight away, but, you know, that could be a future possibility. What does that mean for your customer service sector? You know, how are you going to change your customer service? These are all things that you might want to consider, okay? But again, your strategic choices should be quite robust to cover different opportunities. Why? Because they will pay you the most dividend, or they will pay dividends in most scenarios. What do you mean by that? The more prepared you are, the better off you will be when that particular thing does or does not happen, okay? So if you've got strategic options, if you've got strategic choices that you can implement when something may happen, then you're already ahead of your competition. You've planned ahead. You've actually got something lined up that should a certain situation arise, your company should be able to theoretically handle the problem. And that's the end of scenario planning, okay? So I'm just going to pause the share and we are going to move into Horizon 3. So Horizon 3 is all about thinking of the long-term future, okay? So long-term future is Horizon 3. It's all about 10 years down the line. It's all about 20 years down the line. It's all about long-term thinking. So this is what we're going to move on to. But scenario planning concludes our section on Horizon 2. So that's the medium-term future. How can we perhaps consider what will the business environment look like in 3, 5, 6, 7 years time, okay? That's the kind of window we're looking at here for strategic options 3. So let me just get my slides for the next PowerPoint. Strategic management, details part 3. So again, I'm just going to share them with you all. Okay, hopefully you can again see my screening. So we're moving on to the final lecture, okay, which is Strategic Tools Part 3. Now, in Part 3, we are going to be looking at the tools that can be used by businesses to consolidate their market position. So here we're looking at the new business opportunity, okay? So remember the 3 Horizons framework. Part one was looking at your existing business and how can you continue to do what you do well. Part two, or Horizon 2, was looking at the emerging business. So what can our future business look like? And part three is going to be all about consolidating that new business. So it's about turning those new opportunities into your specific business model. What does that do? Well, it gives you access to what we call robust data. So this is when you look at your data, you look at trends, you look at what's going on out there. How has the business world changed over the last 10, 15, 20 years? And how can we learn from the past to inform decisions into the future? It's also about our learned experiences. So again, when we're looking at the long-term future, we can't guess what's going to happen because it's too far a window, 10, 20 years time. We don't know what the world's going to look like. So many things can change, but it's about looking at our experiences based on historical data, based on what we know, based on research that's being conducted. What do we know about how the future might look? And then finally, how can we use that information to inform the use of the tools that we have available to us? So one of the most useful tools to use in that situation is what we call benchmarking. Now, benchmarking is when you compare the performance of your business service to those of others. Now, again, you might be thinking, well, isn't that based on today's data? Well, yes, it is, but it can also be based on historical data. You can look at, for example, if you're in the grocery sector, in the UK, some of the biggest grocery stores are, Tesco, Sainsbury's, we have Waitrose, we've got Morrison's. These companies might want to look at the performance of their competitors over the last 10 years, last 15 years, and look at who's growing the most, who's growing the least, whose sales have declined, whose sales have grown, who's gained market share, who's lost market share. Why would they want to do that? Because they want to look at, okay, what have they done? What strategies did they use? How have they won so much market share? How have they taken over certain markets? How have they grown their profits? How have they grown their sales? So you can learn a lot from your competition, okay? So benchmarking allows you to see what strategies have been pursued and also allows you to perhaps take an educated guess at what future strategies your competition might be looking to implement, because obviously if they followed a particular path, you can try to figure out, you can try and map what that future path for them might be. So how can we describe benchmarking? Well, basically it's what we call a search for industry best practice. We want to see who's the best in the industry at growing market share, who's the best at growing profits, who's the best at making the most sales, and how can we adopt perhaps, or how can we perhaps look at building into our business model what they're doing. In turn, that can lead us to gain superior performance within our own business. What else is benchmarking useful for? Well, to uncover successful business processes. So basically by observing other businesses, we can identify the processes, the skills, and the competencies that contribute to their success. So again, we can look at benchmarking as a way to understand how is that company behaving? How is that company going about their business? Now, again, you might say, well, isn't that, unethical behavior? Well, yeah, you could say it's spying on the other business. It's trying to, gain a competitive advantage. Yeah, it depends on your moral compass. Some people see that as unethical. Other people see it as a way of exploiting what is out there already. So again, you might be a large director in Tesco or Morrison's, but you might know people that work in Sainsbury's or Waitrose. Can you gain insights from them? How legal is that? Well, that's grey area, unfortunately. There's no right or wrong answer. Some people say that's morally and ethically wrong. Other people say, well, I'm making most of the resources available to me. I'm trying to figure out how I can stay ahead of the market. So again, there's no right or wrong answer here, unfortunately, okay? It can also be used to facilitate knowledge sharing. So knowledge that's acquired about the other business can then be transferred to your own. So again, what you learn about how another business works, what you learn about how the other business performs, you can then transfer that information into your own business. So again, what you learn from your benchmarking activity can then be implemented within your own corporation. It's about gaining competitive advantage. So your business can gain competitive advantage if it applies best practice from other businesses and other industries. So again, how can we stay ahead of our market? Based on what we're learning from others that operate in our space, how can we combine the best of these businesses to come up with our own way of working? How can we perhaps learn from them to shape how we perform going forward? So for example, a small family business selling online can maybe apply some of the social media strategies that are used by, for example, internet blogs to try and attract new customers to the business. Okay, so that's just one example. There's multiple other examples. You can use that. You could similarly, large corporations will also look at one another. Okay, they'll look at how their competition are performing. They'll look at how their competition are doing and how that may influence their own performance, how that may influence what they do going forward. In general, the benchmarking tool is widely used and well recognized. It's not just used by companies, it's also used by institutions, it's used by governments, it's used by standalone entities that look at the performance across different industry areas, across different countries, across different sectors. One such example is the Global Benching Network. So Global Benchmarking Network is a combination of organizations designed to give you advice and insight into how benchmarking works. Okay, so what do you mean by that? It's a way to standardize benchmarking practices. It's a way for us to make sure that we're employing the right tools. So the Global Benchmarking Network, you can Google them. They've got some templates, they've got some advice, they've got examples of information that they've gathered already. And they've shown through a survey that 68% of all businesses use what's called informal benchmarking. So by informal benchmarking, we mean it's benchmarking done perhaps in the boardroom, perhaps done, with some research and development activity that perhaps isn't recorded as a benchmarking activity. So you might not formally call it "we are benchmarking," but they're doing it anyway, okay, without necessarily giving it a title. 49% of businesses use what's called performance benchmarking. So performance benchmarking is where you're looking at what's called KPIs, so key performance indicators. So how is your competition performing? How do you compare to them? So for example, if you are in the customer service or call center environment, particular KPIs are stuff around, call volume handled, amount of time you put the customer on hold, the amount of time the customer's waiting before they speak to someone. A lot of contact centers or customer service centers will have targets. They want to try and minimize the disruption to the customer. They want to try and answer as many calls as possible. So these are all targets that they'll have set, and they'll have key performance indicators to try and measure that, how well they're performing. You can do a benchmark activity with that. You can see, well, okay, this is how well this business did, this is how well that business did. How does that impact what we are doing? Okay. 39% of businesses use what's called best practice benchmarking. So, almost 40% of businesses actually look at what is their competition doing, what practices do they have in place, what processes are they using, and how can we perhaps adopt or learn from those practices and processes to inform what we are doing. Now, there are three major types of benchmarking. Number one is strategic benchmarking. So strategic benchmarking is all about identifying the best way to compete in a given market sector. During this process, you will identify what are called winning strategies. Usually these come from outside your own industry sector that successful competitors use. So again, what you sometimes see is best practice. You don't actually have to look at your direct competition. Sometimes you can learn from other industries. What other industries doing? So for example, if you're working in the customer service or retail sector and you're a large director or you're a strategic practitioner in the customer services or consumer goods sector, what can you maybe learn from the biomedical community? What can you maybe learn from technology sector? What can you learn from manufacturing sector that can be used to complement what you currently do? What are some of the practices and the processes in those industry areas that could maybe be used or adapted to try and fit your industry? During this process, you'll identify what are called winning strategies, and you can use it to look at competitor strategic goals. So again, how can some of these techniques, tools be used to achieve strategic goals that your competitions have maybe set as well? So how can perhaps we identify what are the strategic goals being pursued and how they might influence what your competitors think the future looks like? Because again, at the end of the day, the strategy is all about trying to predict the future. It's about trying to meet the future demand, the future need. So you can look at what your competition strategic goals are, and you can try and figure out, well, okay, based on these strategic goals, here is how they're predicting the future. Are we similar? Are we not similar? Do they have something radically different from us? Why is it different? Why is it not different? These are all things we want to consider. And finally, we can apply these strategies or goals to our own business. So we can look at how these strategies or goals can be used to influence our own business. Then we have performance benchmarking. So performance benchmarking we spoke about already. It's usually looking at your key performance indicators and then looking at how these are different, or how your competition is performing and how you're performing. What can you learn from them? What are they doing that's different to how you're doing things? Okay, so it's about comparing your business's services. Usually it focuses on things like service quality, features, price, speed, reliability, client satisfaction, so on and so forth. However, it can also measure anything that has measurable statistics. You can look at profit comparisons, you can look at revenue growth, you can look at market share changes, so on and so forth. Anything that can be measured can potentially be a performance benchmark. Overall, it determines how strong your services are compared to the competition. That's what you're looking to compare with performance benchmarking. Finally, we have process benchmarking. Now, process benchmarking is all about examining other businesses that engage in similar activities in order to identify those best practices that might be applied to your own process. So again, it's all about, it usually comes from your performance benchmarking. Okay, so what you probably will do is you'll do a performance benchmarking exercise. You'll identify why company X is performing. You'll identify that company X is performing better than everyone else. And for example, client satisfaction, they've got the highest client satisfaction score. You then want to say, well, okay, why have they got the highest client satisfaction score? What are their processes? What do they do? Now, again, this is the bit that sometimes gets morally and ethically cloudy, because how do you get that information? I mean, what I do internally in my company shouldn't really be available to you as my competitor, but unfortunately, that's usually how it works. Research is conducted, you send in moles, shall we say, so people that might go in to do mysterious shopping, people that might go in to try and figure out what's going on. So if I'm trying to work out why my competition is better, I might go in myself or send someone to try and work out, okay, how is things working here? I might even try and get someone to work for them to try and understand what are the processes that are used. Now, again, you might say, well, that's wrong. Why are they allowed to do that? Well, it's just morally and ethically compass-based activities. These are things that, based on our personal moral and ethical perspectives, we might think, oh, that's wrong, we shouldn't be doing that. But at the end of the day, in business, it's all about trying to stay one step ahead. So if you can gain insights into what your competition is doing, you can use that information. Okay. It usually derives from performance benchmarking. I said that already. So you identify your weak points, then you focus on the key processes to eliminate your weaknesses. So we've said already, using performance comparison, you maybe identify that service X is superior but pricier than the competition service Y. You would analyze which processes add most to the cost of the service, and then you would improve them with similar, less cost-heavy processes. So again, you might find that you're doing something and that's costing you more than it's costing your competition. Maybe they've got a better supplier, maybe they've got more efficient ways of working, who knows, but if they're able to do that service for cheaper, what can you learn from them? How can you make your processes more efficient? How can you change what you do to try and reduce the cost of your service, for example? Sticking with benchmarking, there are 4 different approaches to benchmarking, okay? Number 1, we have what's called internal benchmarking. Now that's usually where, if you're a large corporate, you're a multinational organization, perhaps based in 50 different countries around the globe, you might be operating in different geographic locations, okay? You might have subsidiaries in China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, India. You might have subsidiaries in the USA, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Europe, UK, Germany, France, Spain. You might have subsidiaries in Africa. South Africa, countries, Egypt, etc. So what can you learn from those different geographical locations? Or maybe you manage a lot of different services. Maybe you are a diversified conglomerate. You've got lots of different services and products. What can you learn from within those businesses? What can those subsidiaries teach each other? Usually what you tend to find is each country's got their own HR, each country's got their own marketing. How can we learn from our own business? How can my marketing team in Egypt inform what's going on in my marketing team in Italy, for example, okay? So if one particular region or one particular geography is performing particularly well, how can they share their knowledge? How can they share their expertise with other areas of the business? Now, benchmarking is used to compare the work of teams to identify the ones that are working better. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's about saying, how is this team performing compared to that team? What you tend to find is organizations will do internal benchmarking as well based on key performance indicators. So your KPIs tend to be the same, no matter whether you're operating in India or China or the UK or the USA. You'll probably have a similar benchmark for customer service, a similar benchmark for quality of product, so on and so forth. So you can compare what you're doing to your competition and what you're doing compared to your offices in India, compared to your offices in China, and say, okay, why is the Indian office performing poorly? Why is the China office performing poorly? Why is the UK office performing poorly? And you would use that information to then try and figure out, okay, what can the UK learn from India? What can India learn from China? What can China learn from Singapore? So again, it's all about saying, how can our internal resources help us become better? It can be used to compare the work that teams do to identify the ones that are working better and to share knowledge. It's all about sharing knowledge, okay? It's not about saying, okay, this team's performing poorly, we need to bring in new managers, we need to bring in new training tools, we need to bring in perhaps new staff. That's costly. Why not look across your business and see who's doing it well? Who can you maybe use to try and inform others? Who can you maybe use to try and make things better in your area? Now, it's usually used by businesses that have expanded, but which lack the proper knowledge sharing systems. So again, it usually is those businesses that have maybe grown, maybe rapidly grown in the last 5 or 10 years, but perhaps don't quite have the internal knowledge sharing systems in place. A lot of companies nowadays do have learning portals. They do have areas where staff can come together and share their knowledge, share their experience, but some companies don't have a robust performance system like that. So for them, it's quite a useful tool to have because it allows you to properly understand how knowledge sharing systems can affect what your business is doing. You might also look at external or competitive benchmarking. So competitive benchmarking is where a business compares itself with competition inside its industry sector, okay? This is where you're looking at other businesses that are operating in the same market space as you. So for example, as I said, if you're looking at the grocery sector, companies like Aldi, Lidl, Tesco's, Morrison's in the UK, Waitrose, these are all grocery supermarkets. They're all trying to serve the needs of the same market share, okay? They've got obviously a big market, everyone needs groceries, but they're trying to win market share from each other. So it's competitors that operate inside the industry. You usually would use that to compare products and services. It's usually not possible to compare directly your strategy or processes because you will struggle to find a competitor who's willing to share that secret or sensitive information with you. If I'm working at Tesco's, realistically, I don't want Sainsbury's to find out what my strategic goals are, how my strategic policies are shaping what I'm doing. Whereas I might be more willing to share some of that information with somebody from the technology sector in return for something from them, because technically speaking, the technology sector isn't going to disrupt or change what I'm doing, okay? Whereas Sainsbury's can, or Waitrose can, or Aldi can, or Lidl can. Whereas external benchmarking usually can be done both inside and outside your industry area. It can be more beneficial approach due to the higher possibility of you being able to find what are called best practices, okay? So external benchmarking, usually you look outside of your industry. You look at other similar industries, you look at other industries where perhaps, you know, companies have done something. So if you're looking to implement a change program, if you want to change your customer relations management system, but you don't really know how to do that, you might look at a different industry where they've done that and try and learn from their mistakes or learn from what they did. What you tend to find is companies in other industries are more likely to share information with you than companies in your own industry, obviously because they're not competing with you. Okay, so for example, British Petroleum operate in the energy sector and the fuel sector. They're probably more likely to share information with, for example, the IT sector or technology than they are to share information with the energy sector, because obviously in the energy sector they have competition, don't want to share information with the competition. They only want to share it with others. We then have what's called functional benchmarking. Now, functional benchmarking is where managers of functional departments often find it useful to analyze how well their team is performing compared to other functional departments. This is very similar to what we looked at with internal benchmarking, okay? This is you comparing the different functions of your business. So again, why is the marketing team done particularly well? Why have they been able to perhaps come under budget? How have they perhaps delivered certain targets better than the sales team? So again, sales and marketing, sometimes they're one thing, but usually they're separated. You have a sales function and you have a marketing function. They go hand in hand. The better your marketing performs, you tend to find the better your sales do. But for example, if sales are going up, but marketing aren't meeting their targets, they might be wondering, well, okay, what can marketing do differently? How can they learn from what a sales team are doing? What the patterns that a sales team are picking up that marketing can use to inform their marketing activity? Similarly with HR and maybe operations. So again, operations is where you do your core activity. It's where you're using your people to add value to your products and services. Well, what can HR learn from operations? How are people employed? What do they do in their job? What are we asking them to do in operations? How could that be impactful on the HR policy? What can HR do? What can HR learn from that process? How does HR perhaps prevent certain processes from taking place? How does HR help us in understanding how we should manage our employees? So again, it's about learning from each functional area and applying it within an organization. And we can look at a wide range of organizations, even unrelated ones. So functional areas, again, don't have to be internal. They can also be external. So again, how does your marketing team perform compared to the marketing team of some IT company? What are they doing? What are they using that's different to us? Are they using particular technologies? Are they using particular trends? What data perhaps are they using to inform their decision making that perhaps we need to look at using as well? Finally, we have what's called generic benchmarking. Now, this approach usually refers to comparisons that focus on the work processes rather than the business practices. So for example, your business tries to improve its marketing capabilities. That means it's benchmarking itself against business A or business B. So again, it's not about looking at the industry or a type of product or service, it's about looking at the marketing capabilities. So if you're benchmarking yourself against another business, it's about saying, well, okay, I'm working in a particular area. It's completely different to yours. I'm working in biochemical sciences. You're working in retail. It's completely different industry, completely different way of working, completely different way of how we do things. But what can we learn from you? How perhaps do you manage your people that I can learn from your management skills? How do I operate my finances? How do we gather financial information in my industry that's different to yours? What can you learn from me? So generic benchmarking is perhaps just looking generally and saying who's the best at doing this, who's the best at doing that. Doesn't matter what industry they're in, doesn't matter what market they're serving. It's just about learning. So benchmarking as a tool, well, what are some of the advantages of using benchmarking? Well, number one, it's easy to understand and use. I mean, it's quite simple, really. It's about saying, how do we compare and compete against someone based on their performance in this area? Okay, at the very kind of high level, that's all it is. It's also about low costs, but again, those low costs can generate or make huge gains. It helps us bring innovative ideas into a business. It helps provide insights into how other businesses organize their operations and processes, and it helps increase our level of performance compared to our rivals. And finally, it facilitates cooperation between teams and departments, particularly with internal benchmarking.
It allows people to speak to one another. It allows people to learn from one another, to share knowledge with one and another. So again, that can allow you to have increased cooperation, collaboration amongst your internal teams and departments. However, as with any model, it does have some drawbacks or disadvantages. So the first one is you need to find yourself a benchmarking partner. They might think, well, obviously you do, but that can be quite difficult. Someone that's willing to share that level of detail with you realistically won't be a competitor. No competitor wants to share that with you, okay? If you're operating in IT, for example, you know, Infosys or Cytel or all these big companies that offer services, ServiceNow, for example, they're not really going to want to share with each other their processes and practices. They'll be more willing to share outside of their industry sector. So again, you need to find a benchmarking partner who's willing to engage in that activity with you, usually because they want to learn from you. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement, okay? You might be good at customer service. I might be better at manufacturing processes. How can we help each other if I'm in the IT sector and you're in the manufacturing sector, okay? So we learn from each other. We talk to each other, we share information, we share data. It's sometimes impossible to assign a metric that can measure a particular process. So process benchmarking is very difficult. Why? Because you can't really measure a process. You can look at how a process performs and you can say, okay, you know, this process seems to be working. That's a very subjective approach, okay? You can't really measure a process. You can just observe it. You can just document it. You can just see it working. You can't really find a way in which you can say, okay, that process is operating at 70% efficiency. This process, you know, it's difficult to measure process benchmark. You might also want to hire a consultant. Again, that comes at a cost. So you might want to bring in someone external. Consultants are useful because they'll work across a range of different industries. They'll work with lots of different competitors. Unfortunately, they usually also have what's called NDAs, which means they can't share information from one client with another, okay? So a consultant won't come into you and say, oh, by the way, I did some work with your competitor. Here's what they're doing. They can't do that. That's morally and ethically wrong. They'll have signed a contract, which means if they do share that information, they can potentially be sued or put in jail, okay? So they're not going to do that. They're not going to come here and tell you what your competition are doing. But what they can do is they can bring their experience of working for different industries and try to tell you, okay, well, we've done this before, we've done that before, here's how it worked, okay? Now, if your business is not experienced at benchmarking, then the initial costs can be quite high. Again, benchmarking is a useful tool, but it's not an inexpensive tool. It comes at a cost. You know, sometimes you have to pay people to access that information. Sometimes you have to bring in consultants. They can be expensive. Other times you have to figure out, you know, what are the internal capabilities that you have available already that can be used. So it's unfortunately one of those things that can't really be guessed or second guessed. Okay, you can't put a price on benchmarking. It just depends on the level of detail you're looking for and what areas you're investigating. Managers might resist the change if you need to improve business performance. Again, what you tend to find internally to your organization is what's called internal resistance or resistance to change. Why? Because people that work for you, they'll be used to working in a particular way. They'll be used to doing things. They'll be used to perhaps delivering a particular product or service in a particular way, okay? Not because, you know, they intentionally were being difficult, just that's what they've done their whole life. They've been doing something for 20 years, 25 years. They don't really want to change. They know their jobs inside out. They don't really want to do something differently. But sometimes you need to do that, okay? Just because something worked 5-10 years ago doesn't mean it's always going to work. New technologies come out, new ways of working come out, new performance measures come out. Customer needs change, they evolve. So your customers 10 years ago, 20 years ago had different needs to your customers of today or the customers of the future. So again, it's about saying, how can we change our internal capability to be able to match the needs of our customer? So you might have to come across resistance in your workers to that change. Now, some of these best practices simply will not be applicable to our business. So again, someone might be doing excellent in a particular area, but that only works in their industry, okay? Because of the nature of their industry, because of the nature of what their customers want and need, it works. But based on our business, it wouldn't work because we have a different industry. We're looking at a different set of customers. We're looking at different customer needs. So again, someone might be really, really good at what they're doing, but because they're working in a particular sector, in that sector, it makes sense. But our industry or in our market sector, it just doesn't work. So again, that's something to watch out for. Couple of guidelines, and I'm going to stop here because I've been talking for a long time and I think it's useful to take a break. So I make it 11:10 on my clock. Let's come back in 10 minutes and we can finish off today's session, okay? So let's aim to be back for 11:20 a.m. UK time. It's a 10-minute break and then we will resume, okay? Thank you very much. Right, welcome back from the break. So if you recall, we were looking at benchmarking and we were specifically focusing on the drawbacks and the advantages of using the benchmarking tool. So a couple of guidelines that I think are useful, particularly if you're going to be using the benchmarking tool for your assignment for this module. Only choose services and processes which are performing poorly in your chosen organization. Okay, so for example, if you already know that you're doing something good, then it wastes your time and money. Now, obviously, in your assignment, you've got the opportunity to look at different areas, and yes, you might want to focus on things that are good as well. But if you're an actual management consultant or you're a strategy practitioner, then the company that you've been contracted to, the company that's paying you, they probably already know what they're doing well. Okay, there's no point in you coming back to them and saying you're the best at everything, full stop, that's it. Well, that's pointless. That's not giving them any value add. Okay, you need to be able to say, okay, these are things that everybody already knows we're good at. These are things that, there's evidence to say that we're the best at already. I'm not going to focus too much resource on this. Yes, it's useful to document it. Yes, it's useful to say that, based on evidence, this company or company X is doing well at things like A, B, C, but the onus or the importance or the value, I should say, of benchmarking comes from looking at areas where the company that you're working for or the company that you're contracted to is perhaps not doing so well. Okay, they want to know about the areas that are performing poorly. They want to know about the areas where they can make improvement. So you need to be able to define specific metrics to measure. Again, when you're doing it, there'll be different metrics. Client satisfaction or customer satisfaction is a different measure from market share. It's a different measure from profit and growth, different measure from sales revenue growth. It's a different measure from speed of service, from quality, from all these different things. There's different ways to measure them. So you have to be consistent. If you're looking at quality for company A, the way in which company A documents quality might be different from the way in which company B document quality. So you have to try and find a way to benchmark or stabilize that basis first, okay, to try and see how can you make the comparison similar or at least to mean the same thing. Now, again, for example, some people say financial measures are difficult to compare, particularly because of different accounting practices. Now, thankfully, in Europe, most companies use similar or same accounting practice, so there's not too many dissimilarities. But if you're comparing the performance of a UK business to a US business, there's two slightly different ways of accounting here. So in the UK, we have a different set of practices. The USA have another set of practices, okay? They're not the same. So the way in which they report their accounts can be very different to ours. So if you're comparing, for example, revenue growth, the way in which they perhaps document their revenue is different to the way in which people in the UK document revenue. So it's not always as simple as saying, okay, let's just convert it. Then you've also got things like currency conversion. Just because they're making 600 million and the UK company is only making 500 million, doesn't necessarily mean they're better, because obviously the exchange rate might mean that, in real terms, the US company making 600 million is actually only making 450 million UK pounds. So again, you've got to make sure you take into consideration things like exchange rates. You've got a baseline, is what I'm trying to say, okay? So when you're looking at your performance measure, you've got to be able to baseline them so they're consistent. You have to prepare your business for change. So again, this is more for a practitioner perspective. Obviously, for in your assignment, you can't do that, but it will be quite useful for you to document, what might be some of the resistance barriers if you are looking at, implementing a strategic change using benchmarking. What internal resistance might you find? What elements, what areas would perhaps need some change management program might need people to be brought on side. How do you perhaps motivate or influence your people to bring them on side? And finally, if you were doing this in practice, you'd want to choose a team that is qualified, okay? So again, benchmarking might be easy to use, but you want to make sure you've got the right people doing the benchmarking exercise. You want to include people like managers who are subsequently responsible for implementing that change. So again, if you're making a change in the HR area and you don't have a single HR manager as part of your benchmarking team, well, that's silly because they're the ones that are going to be responsible for implementing that change. Similarly, if you're benchmarking operations, then you want to bring operations managers with you on the benchmarking journey because you want them to see, how things are being done differently elsewhere and what can be learned and applied in your business. So again, making sure you're involved, you're involving and engaging the stakeholders that will be affected is a good way to conduct your benchmarking activity. Further guidelines, participate in what's called benchmarking networks. I'll give you one example, the Global Benchmarking Network. That's just one. There's multiple other benchmarking networks. Some countries have their own country-specific ones. There's more general kind of worldwide ones. Again, these are useful forums to be involved in because this is where companies will share some of their experiences, some of their knowledge, some of their expertise in benchmarking. So again, rather than designing your own benchmark, sometimes it's better to copy what's already been done. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. You don't want to, use up time, resources that perhaps could be used elsewhere. Finally, the best standards and ideas come across in unrelated areas. So again, significantly, what you tend to find is new or innovative ideas will only tend to come from usually industries or markets that you've not considered. Why am I saying that? Because realistically, if you're already in a market or in an industry, then chances are you're doing things at least somewhat vaguely similar to what your competition are doing, okay? In order for you to even operate in that market, to survive in that market, you must be doing something right. You must be doing something that is at least acceptable to your client, or sorry, to your market. So chances are your practices might not be identical, but they'll be very, very similar to what your competition are doing. So in order for you to get novel or innovative or completely new insights into how you could do things differently, realistically, you should be looking outside of your industry sector. What can other industries do, or what do other industries do that you can use to your advantage? How can you apply certain technologies? How can you apply certain frameworks, certain ways of working that can be useful to your organization? So we have what's called a benchmarking wheel. This allows you to kind of understand how the benchmarking process works. Now, rather than talking about it here, I'm going to go through the 5-stage process with you. So stage 1 is all about planning. It's where you bring your team together and you define what you need to do and you want to compare to and assign metrics to it. You then find benchmarking partners. As I said, you need to ideally find someone who's willing to share information with you. And in order to share information with you, they'll be looking for something in return, either money, so pay us and we'll share our information, or let's work together. You tell me more about your industry and what you do and how I can learn from you, and I'll do the same for you. So it's a mutually beneficial agreement. And then you collect. So this is when you start gathering your data. So what methods are you going to use to gather data? Are you going to interview people in your benchmark organization? Are you going to look at surveys? Are you going to look at the company documents? What are you going to do to gather the data that you need? Stage 4, you analyze. So again, this is when you start comparing. This is what we do. This is what they do. What gaps are there in performance between us and the businesses we have benchmarked? Then we gather those results and provide recommendations on how we believe our performances can be improved. And finally, step 5 is moving into the improvement stage. This is when you implement the changes to your services, your processes, and your strategy to try and become a better organization. Now, obviously, this is a cyclical process. So as soon as you do that, you'll immediately be starting thinking about the future. You'll be thinking about, okay, what's next? What do I need to plan now? What's the future change that need to be made? So it's almost like a never-ending wheel. It's a continuous improvement process. It's not about saying, okay, we benchmarked in 2010. That's it. We don't need to benchmark for another 20 years. That's not true. You need to consistently keep doing it. So every couple of years, some people even do it every year, start looking at, okay, this is what we did, this is what the performance uptake was, what we're going to do next, where's the next area we need to focus on. So again, it's a continuous process. As soon as you hit improve, you're moving back towards planning and looking at the next stage. And that, in a nutshell, is benchmarking. Okay, so that's what benchmarking is all about. Similar to benchmarking is something called gap analysis. Okay, so gap analysis is basically where we look at current performance to identify a difference between our current state of business and where we want to be. So here is what we're doing with gap analysis. We're looking at where we are today. So, you know, how are we performing today? And then we will look at where do we want to be in 10 years' time? So, you know, what is the goal in 10 years' time? What do you want to achieve? And then you're working backwards. Okay, you're trying to fill the gap, you're closing the gap. So you're saying to get from, for example, $100 million in sales today to perhaps $1 billion in sales in 2031, what do I need to do? What's the process we need to go by? What do we need to improve? What do we need to do better? And that's called your gap, okay? Gap is the area between now and your performance today versus your desired performance in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, whatever it may be. How do you identify the gaps? Well, you look at ways in which you can analyze the business efficiency. You can look at ways in which your service offering should be improved. You can look at ways in which profitability can be improved. So again, these are some of the targets you might want to set in order to try and reduce that gap. And you then spend energy and resources on addressing the gaps that emerge. So again, it's a 4-step process to gap analysis. Step 1 is identifying the current state of your business. You know, what is your strategic plan? What's the main priority of that plan? You know, what do you want to do? What's your targets? And what, you know, you might not have a lot of current states. You know, again, you might have a few different ones. You might have, you know, today you're good at X, Y, and Z. You're bad at A, B, C. You know, you've got certain targets. So maybe a few different ones that are not related directly. So for example, we might have a gap in HR and have a gap in marketing. 2 completely different areas, not necessarily influenced by the same policy. So again, you might have a few different gap analyses that you have to conduct. So the gap analysis isn't a one model fits everything. It's more of a, okay, based on this area, this is the gap. Based on this area, this is the gap. So you can have a few different gaps. But realistically, you don't really want to have any more than 4 or 5, because otherwise you're going to struggle, because, you know, companies have finite resources. If companies had all the resources in the world, then they could address every single gap as soon as they want. But unfortunately, that's not true. Companies only have limited resources, you know, limited capital, labor, limited technologies. So, you know, what can they best utilize those resources to try and achieve efficiencies in? It's about trying to identify those gaps that you can realistically fill up. You got to identify where you want to be with your firm. So the future goal is sometimes referred to as the desired state, the future target, or the stretch goal. How are we going to get there? What are we trying to achieve? You know, what's that future target? What's that stretch goal we want to do? And how you're doing in your current state. So that's your step 1. And then where do you want to be within that reasonable time frame? So again, what's the time frame we're looking at? We want to identify the gaps in our business. So where do we know our business is? How do we know how well it's performing? You know where you want it to be in the future. So again, comparing today and the future, and then saying, how do we bridge that gap? You need to ensure that your goal and current state exist in the same time period. So again, you know, you need to be looking at a consistent time period. You can't then say, you know, oh, the gap analysis shows that we can achieve this goal by 2050. Well, that's not any good, because you want to try and achieve it in the next 10 years or 20 years. You need to have a specific goal in mind. You can't just move the goalposts. The goalposts need to be consistent. But with gap analysis, what you also need to figure out is, well, why is there a gap here? Because the only way you can address the gap is by understanding why that gap exists. What is causing that gap? What is preventing your business from achieving their particular goals, their particular objectives, the strategic plan? So you've got to start by asking yourself questions. You've got to ask yourself, you know, why are clients difficult to work with? Why do they want bespoke work? And this is an example of the 5 whys framework. So you've probably heard of the 5 whys framework. So for example, one of the questions you might ask is, well, why are your clients so difficult to work with? And then the answer you might get may be because they want something bespoke. Well, then the next question would be, well, why do they want something bespoke? And then the answer may be because they're dealing with different problem than our firm imagined. Then the question becomes, okay, well, why did we not imagine that problem? Why were we not able to figure it out? And then the answer to that might be because we started out in one part of the legal sector and most of our clients or customers are now in a different sector. So the question then might be, well, okay, why have we not developed a service to match that? And then the answer to that may be because our team is not thinking about new service offerings. So again, okay, so why is your team not thinking about new service offerings? And then the answer to that is because we're too busy doing X, Y, or Z. So again, you started off by asking why our clients are difficult to work with. And the answer you ended up coming up with was because your organization is too busy focusing on different areas. So again, the 5 whys framework is useful. But that's not to say it should only ever be 5 whys. Sometimes it could be more than 5 whys. But usually when you start asking why questions, you end up getting to a level where you discover the answer is actually very, very different, or the real problem, or the real issue area is very, very different to what you thought it was. So they thought the problem was our clients are being difficult, but the answer really is they're too busy focusing on areas that aren't actually adding value. They're too busy focusing on areas that don't do anything for their organization. And that's something to bear in mind here. So once you've done that, you have to then devise strategies that can be used to close the gap that's been identified. So how do you do that? Well, you make base improvements on the information that you uncover. You consider the cost of implementing for each solution. You identify end dates when you aim to have those gaps resolved. So again, your target goal might not be for another 10 years, but in order to meet that target goal, you may have objectives, you may have milestones to achieve in the next 1 year, 24 months, 36 months, so on and so forth. So the milestones might not always be 10 years out. The milestones can be sooner. Maybe the quicker you plug the gap, the quicker you can reach your goal. So again, the gap analysis doesn't mean you have to set 10-year targets or 20-year targets. It means you have to figure out how can you improve what you're doing within a certified or a particular time frame such that you can generate the returns you want to generate in as short a time frame as possible. However, there's something to caveat that with, saying, we have to be careful about trying to close too many gaps too quickly. Why? Because some gaps are related, and we can think about, oh, it's easy to do this, this, and this together, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they're unrelated, and when they are unrelated, you can end up putting too much stress on your business by trying to get to them all at the one time. Perhaps you'll actually underperform, you won't perform to a level you would expect. So again, just be careful when you're carrying out gap analysis that you don't end up trying to take on too much, because if you do, that will also cause your organization problems. Different types of gaps. Well, there's a skills gap. Skills gap is usually the difference or the variance between the skill of your workforce and the skills required by the business. Now, to do a skills gap analysis, you might want to identify what training or hiring requirements there are in the business. This allows you to identify the variance, allows you to identify strategies in which you can reduce that gap. Some tools that are usually used to identify skills gap are things like questionnaires. So providing your staff with questionnaires, asking them about their skills. Perhaps doing performance assessments to understand, how well they're performing. So give them a test, give them some training, ask them questions on what they've learned. Group discussions, so get them to talk to one another, understand from each other, where the gaps are. And finally, interviews. Some companies even interview the staff, they bring them into a room, try to understand, okay, how do you feel about this? What are your opinions on the training? What's your opinions on this? So there's ways in which you can identify the skills gap. Now, the primary sources of these desired skill levels usually combine the business plan or the business goals with the long-term objectives or the long-term future orientation. So primary solutions to that are looking at ways in which we can identify employees' training requirements and establishing how those needs can be met. How do we perform a skills gap analysis? Well, step one is this plan, okay? How do we plan it? And the skills gap, as I said, can be analysed at 2 different levels, both the individual level, which is when you're looking at a particular job or a particular area, and secondly, at a team level. So a team level looks at assessing whether employees have the skills needed for a particular project or for a particular resource or for a particular way in which to work. Okay, so It's not just about individual gaps. You might find that skills gap can exist at a team level. Maybe you don't have the necessary training in place. Maybe you haven't given your team the necessary equipment, the necessary tools to carry out their job. So it could be a team-based skills gap. It doesn't always have to be an individual, okay? Usually you find it's a combination of both, okay? There'll be some things that could be done better by you as a company to try and give your staff everything they need, or it sometimes just comes down to the individual. Maybe your recruitment was flawed, maybe you brought in people that don't fit with the ethos of your company, people that perhaps aren't performing to a level they should be performing at. So again, that's when you look at performance management frameworks. You look at trying to implement training and development, give them a chance to prove that they deserve to work here. Now, once you've done the planning part, you then identify the skills. So which skills does the business value? What skills do we need to serve the customers of the future? What is the future going to be in 10 years' time? What skills will we need to be able to serve the needs of our customers? Which skills do employees require to do their jobs now? So in order to do their jobs today, what skills do our employees need to demonstrate? Which skills do employees require to do their jobs in the future? So again, it's about saying, what can they do today? Can they do everything that's required of them today? Yes or no? Can they do everything that's required of them in the future? Yes or no? And then figure out, how do you get to that state? Finally, you want to measure current skills. Sorry, I was going to say finally. Second last, you have to measure current skills. So that's about understanding what are the existing skills. And I said already, you can do interviews, you can do questionnaires, you can do a lot of different things. And finally, once you've identified the skills gap based on the current skills and the skills you want them to have, you then take action. And that can either be by training. So you train employees to fill positions, or you hire new employees that can perhaps help you fill the skills gap. Outsourcing is another option. I'm sure you've all heard of outsourcing, but outsourcing is basically where you try to find ways in which you can, for example, decrease your costs, increase your efficiency, or bring in a third party that can provide a service or handle operations that you previously did in-house. So outsourcing can either be an expensive or a cheap option, depending on what you're doing. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, a lot of companies in the 90s or the early 90s started outsourcing a lot of their operations to countries that were developing or developing world countries. So a lot of the banking sector, for example, outsourced their customer service to countries like India, countries that had fairly educated workforces, but they were able to get away with paying them a lot less money. A lot of the IT companies have IT help desks in India. Why? Because Indians are quite good at IT. They've got skills in India that are quite useful to IT sector. But most importantly, wages are a lot lower. They can get away with paying people a lot less money than they have to pay them in the UK or in the US. So again, you can decrease your cost, you can increase your efficiency, and it allows you to provide the same service or a similar service without incurring the same level of costs. Process of outsourcing functions can also be referred to as contracting out. So if you hear someone talking about contracting out or outsourcing, they very much mean the same thing. And what does it involve? Well, it involves engaging what we call third-party owners, okay? So you tend to find as companies that provide that service. So you have companies like Infosys, Sitel, you have companies like Teleperformance or Capita in the UK. These are all business service providers that will offer you a service in return for a contract, okay? So a lot of companies in the UK use these service parties to provide the customer service function. Types of outsourcing work, these are the areas of work that tend to be outsourced. So stuff like writing content, stuff like customer support, marketing, even human resources, accounting, taxing and compliance, finance functions and training. These are all things that sometimes get outsourced because it's cheaper or it's more efficient to your organization of having someone else to do it for them rather than recruiting people into your firm. It allows your firm to focus on those areas that are of value add to your company, the areas that will allow your company to realize the most benefits. A couple of examples here of where outsourcing can be used. Again, these are real examples, but I've removed the company's names. So I've called them business A, business B, and business C. But these are all things that have really happened. Okay, these are case studies that I've taken from organizations that have used outsourcing
to try and address their concerns. I'm not going to read them all, they're on the screen. Feel free to read them and understand what's being said here. But again, just examples of different areas in which businesses may wish to outsource or contract out in order to realize value for their value chain. I'm going to leave that up for a minute if everybody wants to just kind of take in what's on the screen in front of them. Okay, hopefully we've had a chance to read through these. So what about advantages of outsourcing? So why is outsourcing done? Well, as I said already, it can reduce your internal labour costs and overheads. If you can outsource the function, you no longer have to permanently recruit these people to work for you, okay? You can just focus on doing your core service. So if you're a manufacturer, you can focus on manufacturing. You don't have to worry about HR or training or finance. You can just outsource it and get someone else to do all that for you. So again, it's a way in which you can save money. It improves your focus on core competencies. So again, it allows you to focus on the things that you need to be doing. Again, kind of tying in my idea from above. Frees up your internal resources to use for other purposes. So again, your company can then focus on using your resources for things that add value for your organization. It reduces risk by sharing with external parties. So again, rather than you providing everything yourself, and for example, say your IT systems go down, or there's an issue, or there's an outage, or there's a problem in your country. So for example, take countries where we've seen, Afghanistan, for example. If you're a business in Afghanistan, you're probably not operating right now because of the uncertainty and the political tensions that currently exist in Afghanistan. So again, if you were doing everything all by yourself in Afghanistan, then you might have problems today. Whereas if you were outsourcing some of your functions, then at least not all of your business will be impacted. At least some of your business can do what it needs to do. Finally, it's a way of improving your flexibility and your efficiency. It's a way of becoming better. It's a way of becoming more streamlined by focusing on the core value add activities yourself and outsourcing the areas that perhaps add little or no value to what you do. But then again, as with most of the frameworks I've covered with you, there are some disadvantages to outsourcing too. Firstly, you can risk losing some of your sensitive data. Because you are outsourcing, you're sharing information with outsourcers, there's a certain degree of losing information, okay? You don't know who the outsourcer is going to recruit. You don't know the qualities of those people. You don't know the kind of staff they're recruiting. That information could get leaked, that information could get shared. Obviously, you'll have NDA contracts. So again, if that happens, you can probably sue the outsourcer, or you can, impose some kind of financial penalty. But again, you are liable, or you are at risk, of losing certain information that you perhaps don't want shared in public domain. There's loss of management control and inability to control activities that are outsourced. So again, as a management function, you don't have that same degree of control. You've got inability to control activities that are outsourced. Outsourcing companies may impose what's called unexpected costs. So again, your outsourcing companies, they might not actually be able to utilize or gain in the same way. And finally, there can be a lack of what's called quality control. So third parties are often driven by profit motives. They don't necessarily care about your services in the same way that you would. You care about your customers. You want to keep your customers on side. I'm not saying a third party don't. Obviously, they want to be able to show that they're doing a good job, but realistically, they're driven by profit. They're driven by the size of the contract and the way in which they can generate value by
minimizing their own costs and gaining more from you, okay? They want you to pay them to deliver the service, but obviously they're not going to want to make a loss on that setup. They obviously want to try and make a profit on that as well. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of strategic management module. So we've covered a lot. I'm sure you will agree. Over the last 3 sessions, we've looked at, oh, sorry, I'm sharing my screen. We have looked at outsourcing, and we have looked at gap analysis, and finally we started off by looking at benchmarking as the longer term or Horizon 3 tools and frameworks. Now, as I said already, there's 3 horizons, and we pegged our discussion on all 3 of horizons 1, 2, and 3. Tools I've given you are useful to allow you to understand how those tools can look at our performance. They can look at how we can improve, and they provide us with useful insights into strategic choices that we can perhaps look to make. So for your assignment for this module, I am looking for you to focus on either horizons 1, 2, or 3. You can choose to focus on more than one, but that can sometimes make your discussion quite difficult to do. So remember, you have to be quite clear on what horizon you're focusing on, and then move to a different horizon and make it clear. It's up to you. I'm not going to determine that for you. It's your choice, but make it clear to your reader, you know, what you're trying to say, what horizon you're looking at, why you've chosen that horizon, which tools you use. Apply those tools to a company of your choice. My advice would be choose a big organization, someone you can research, okay? You know, the usual ones being Apple, Google, etc. You know, big companies that you can get a lot of information on. Don't choose a small company, because you'll find that you can't really access a lot of data on them. So a company in which we can access data easily, and then do some of the analysis that I've given you, some of the tools and frameworks that I've taught you, apply them in your assignment. Don't forget the importance of analysis. So it's not just about applying the tools and that's it. It's about then analyzing. Tell me, what do the tools show? What insights or what knowledge have you gained? How can that be used to impact strategic decision making? Talk to me about some of the benefits of using that tool. Talk to me about some of the drawbacks. What's not good about that tool? What doesn't allow you to gain certain insights? Okay, so it's not just about the good stuff. It's also about recognizing the bad stuff too. So your assignment should be quite holistic. It's not just about showing me the good things, it's about showing me the bad things as well. Okay, any questions?
Doctor, I have a question.
Yes.
About the calculations. Is it required, like beta and return on asset and that? Is it required for this? Because I